But we are actually trying to have a conversation about how companies and organization in kind of a more general way can use the tools that are available today not only to engage conversations with their stakeholders, but actually to understand better how they work and the dynamics within the organization themselves. And I think that it's very interesting also to analyze how social tools inside organization can be used, how they can change the dynamics of how information goes through the companies. From this point of view, I would like to start with Johan and his famous horse example.
Well, yes, to pick up on the theme of horses, some of you may be aware that there was an issue with horse meat getting into the food chain in the United Kingdom. And one of the first places this became apparent was with the large supermarket chain Tesco's. And I was just suggesting that if Tesco's had had a large enough, grown up enough, active enough internal network, then when somebody said, has anybody else noticed that horse, something might have been done about it. And I was thinking about this in the context of what Dave was saying about anarchism and fascism. And, you know, I have in the past been called an organizational anarchist, and I'm quite comfortable with that in the sense of redressing an imbalance that most of our organizations appear to be run by fascists. But I was really interested, I wanted to talk more with Dave about that thing about the bit in the middle and the structure that you need between fascism and anarchy. Still depends on who owns the stories. You know, who decides what structure has more or less relevance? Who decides which people are more or less relevant to that structure or have more or less value to add? And I think that's, because let's face it, it's all about power. And inside organizations, this is very apparent that it's about power. And those with power currently don't like giving it up. So you have to have very strong, valid, workable reasons for them to do so.
I think that well, it all boils down about exchanging information and find ways to start conversations inside. I think that we might finally starting to get the concept that markets are conversations. Maybe not. Somebody is noticing. I wonder how much companies are actually realizing that the conversations start inside the organization. I mean, quite often they are investing in trying to engage and to create conversation with the rest of the world. As we have said, there are companies that are starting to be 2.0, using now an old term, outside, but they are now not even 1.0 inside. So how do you see how prepared are companies to actually have open conversations inside the organizations?
Well, I think that there are a great many companies in the world, and some are more prepared than others. The ones that listen to you are very prepared, even if they're not following up on them where they should be. There's a really great talk, a TED talk given a couple of years ago by a scientist named Jeffrey West. And he addressed the question of why it is that networks live and companies die. And he compared networks to cities, and cities are places where lots of businesses come and go, but cities tend to persist. You can have a plague, you can bomb a city, you can have a city burned down, and for some reason the city survives. And it's because there are many, many network nodes in a city, and there are lots of rich interactions among them. And the larger and more rich those interactions become, the more the whole thrives. It is very, very hard for a modern corporation, and by modern I mean since the industrial age began, to not act like a life form in the sense that they are self-contained and don't get increasing returns as they grow larger. They get diminishing returns because they are not open to the world. I think in some ways we are making a new kind of corporation now, and the internet itself is modeling that. The internet was very lightly designed. In thinking about the state of the net, I was very struck in the talks earlier this morning, even though I don't understand Italian, I love the visuals. And the net is not Facebook and Google and the rest of them. These are only a few years old, and they're all going to die anyway, because that is the nature of things as long as they remain closed. And but the net will live, because the light design of the net is end-to-end. It's point-to-point. The parts of the net that matter most are you and me and everybody in this room who's connected. And this year we're connecting with Twitter, and next year or 2 or 5 years from now we'll be connecting through other conveniences. But what matters is the protocol, and protocols are nothing more than manners. If it had, all due respect to the telecoms of the world, if it had been left up to them, we never would have had the net, because it does not have a billing system built into it. Everything that doesn't work about the net right now, frankly, is the attempt to bill it all the time. Go to your hotel. Getting on at the hotel is a pain in the butt. But Airbnb, for example, which is sort of a subject of controversy at the moment, which I helped start in a way because we had trouble booking with it on the way over here. There's heuristics going on there right now. The struggle for them is dealing with the world outside, debugging their new identification system for people when there is no perfect system yet. But the people will help them figure that out. I mean, this goes very well with what David's been saying here. It was a fabulous talk, by the way. So I think, the internet that we know now is only 18 years old. It's only been here since 1995. It's really early. We have a lot to work out yet. But I think the companies that survive are going to be the ones that understand that the conversation that matters is the network one of which they are a part, and that they are temporary conveniences built by the people who work there and the people who buy their services, rather than these forts on a medieval model that stand alone and apart and self-contained.
Partial reaction to this, and a minor disagreement with you, but not a major one. I actually don't think it's as much about power as it is about attention. And we're finding more and more in cognitive neuroscience that attention is the key aspect.
Are you saying attention?
Attention. So, I mean, Gary Klein and I, who's also done a lot of work in this, created a model called See, Attend, Act. Do I see the data? Do I pay attention to the data? Will I act on the data? 3 completely separate processes. And it's easy to reinterpretation of that as power, but generally, if you can get people to pay attention, you can modify behavior. We're finding, for example, that by creating a quant approach, that it's not who owns the story, because the story can be withheld. It's the interpretation of the story which matters. So if I've got all of my employees acting as a sensor network, I've got numerical data from that. If I've got a strong correlation on that, I pay attention, then the stories give me an explanation of what the numbers mean. It's more likely I'll act in a way which doesn't follow my normal interests.
Okay, so I still end up with a problem where, we do agree that set of contextual stories helps people make better decisions. The more stories, the better decisions. But somebody or something still has to make judgments.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think that's the other problem, all right, is that we've no longer trained managers to make judgments. We actually train them to follow figures. So in my day, when I first became a general manager, I wasn't allowed to go on the general management program until I'd done a year in sales, hit my targets, a year in production, hit my targets, a year in support, and hit my targets. Because that way I had the tacit knowledge or understanding not to make stupid decisions. Now people do a BA in business studies, an MBA, they go into a major consultancy firm, then they move sideways into senior management roles. Actually, they've got no idea what the hell is going on. They're managing everything off a spreadsheet, yet without the ability to exercise judgment. So I think one of the ways we can overcome that in the short term is by engaging employees and customers in managed networks. And I mean managed networks, not just free networks. Because, and there's a good example on this, Wikipedia works because it has constraints. The net hasn't yet evolved the constraints. So all the constraints in Wikipedia evolved. But if you go onto the net and you go into a listserv, you can have flame wars left, right, and center. That doesn't happen in Wikipedia. You'll be blocked from editing Wikipedia within 24 hours. So how we emerge constraints, and the final point on this, I think we need to see companies as loosely coupled networks, not as hierarchies. Now, this is actually what IBM paid me for 7 years to design. And they let me experiment on it in South Africa and New Zealand because they don't regard those as countries. And I thought it was great because they both play rugby, so it was great, all right? There's no problem with that whatsoever. And then we sat in front of the current CEO of IBM, I remember this, and we said, we got a great model, so we can now create the whole of global services, which is what they bought the company I was involved in to create, into a loosely coupled network. And we went through it, and they were saying, this is Linux for consultancy, and we own Linus, which was very complementary. Then it goes badly wrong, because Ginny said, what does that mean? I said, we lay off 90% of the workforce, deploy 500% of the capability. And we've checked this out, and it's only the blue dollar guys who don't like the idea. Blue dollar is IBM slang for people who manage internal budgets, who never sell themselves for green dollars. And she looked at me and she said, so I'll manage the smallest unit in IBM? And I said, but the biggest network. And at that point, we'd lost it. Now, I think the issue is organizations that can manage to center networks are going to survive. Organizations that try and control them won't.
But in the short term, and to come back at you a little bit about the power again, the reason you no longer work for IBM is less to do with lack of attention and more to do with power, and the fact that you were provoking those in power with ideas that they found uncomfortable. And a local example from the BBC recently was where they'd attempted to have some centralized big system thing to do all the production management and data and associated stuff. And they'd spent £10 million on it, I think, roughly. And they just cancelled the whole project and suspended the head of technology. Now that, for me, is an ideological problem. That's because they were still trying to have this centralized, controlled, command and control type of environment where you can get a perfect solution, as opposed to a networked bunch of hackers, pragmatic, tactical, and messy. And it's not just that they understand that alternative. They don't like that alternative and will fight against that alternative.
I agree with that and disagree at the same time. And I agree on the BBC case, right? I think also IBM has had two turning points in recent history where it could have reinvented itself. It got it right with Lou Gerstner, but then when Denny, as they created global services, when Denny got ill and lost to Sam, at that point global services were going to be branded differently with a separate culture. And that would have been radically different. As it was, they forced it into the manufacturing model. I think the next choice was the one I presented, and actually what was interesting, it was when we became official rather than being dissenters that we got into trouble, because the model we proposed didn't fit a manufacturing model and that was embedded. So I think you will see behemoths like IBM go, and I think it's only a matter of time, to be honest, before they disintegrate. I think you can do the same with Microsoft, the same with Google, because the dominant predator of one short-term period always loses when the ecology changes. Yeah? But that doesn't mean that you can't, particularly in government, and I think this is where it's more important, creating governments as loosely coupled networks is key, because industry can evolve by failure. Governments can't evolve by failure, which is why taking industrial models into government is fundamentally an error in my view.
Not that I'm trying to manage you in any way, by the way. You're all free agents of change.
You really think we'd let you?
No, and I think that we are going to start open the conversation with all the other free agents out there. I reread Words of End recently because it's describing, as you were saying, we're all part of the network. We are the network, and the organizations of the network on the internet are just here for some time. And in this perspective, if we are all part of the network, then one might argue that what is going on inside the company, there is no real difference between what is going on inside the company, what is going on outside the organization in terms of interactions. I mean, a company or any organization can actually leverage the fact that by opening up its system, by being, in a way, not transparent in terms of how information flow, because of course there must be some information that lives only within the company, but in terms of how the methods of exchanging information could be the same, how they have a conversation with the outside world and within the company themselves. So, I mean, do you think there should be a difference between the conversation inside a company and the conversation between the organization and the rest of the world, or should they be the same in a way?
I suppose the short answer is whatever works. It's interesting to me that I did two sort of stories. One is there's a guy named Dan Fry who runs a division at IBM in Portland, Oregon, that employs a number of alpha-level main Linux hackers, the guy who runs the file system, a few other people. And IBM made a big deal around the year 1999 or 2000 that we're all about Linux now, and I'm sure you remember this whole thing. And Dan told me that it took IBM 6 years before they realized they couldn't tell the Linux hackers what to do, that in fact it was the other way around. That they kept telling them, well, you need to bias the kernel to our products and our services, and the hackers told them to screw off. They're not going to do that, and they're just going to go ahead and do what's best for everybody. And it turned out what was best for everybody was best for IBM as well. And that was an internal conversation that took 6 years, right? And it took place between human beings who crashed into each other, and at least in a productive sense, there was a complex adaptive system there that was at work. Now, if you look at, it's interesting to me that there are some companies like Microsoft, for example, where there are lots of people blogging inside of Microsoft. Name one Apple blogger. I don't think that you can. Apple's a very control-freaky company. But I think it helped Apple an enormous amount when it started its retail stores, because it took a number of Apple obsessives and made them into geniuses who interacted directly with people. Now, to what extent that constitutes the heuristics of the company and where they're learning from customers, I imagine it does. I can't imagine it wouldn't. But it's so totally humanized a company that was really very inhuman in a lot of other ways, and still is. And I think that to a large degree has helped Apple and has helped sustain them since Steve died, because they haven't come out with much since then. And nobody wants to talk about that except investors. But there's, you know, it's, I mean, I said earlier the internet was only 18 years old. Modern industry is only 150 years old. And it's adapting right now. It's trying to adapt to a world in which every customer, every user is in a position of influence, can do a lot. And we don't have the institutional systems in place yet to fully deal with that, where anybody can contribute to the company. And that's part of what I'm working on. We can talk about it tomorrow. But it's, you know, again, it's early, and there'll be successes and failures. We are all stakeholders, though. The term stakeholder I don't like unless it involves everybody who's a customer.
Well, it's what you always say, that it's going to take time.
It's going to take time, but it's also the fact that the lines are getting so blurred, because half of your employees are customers. They're all on the internet anyway. The very idea, you know, the whole thing of employee engagement is a big thing at the moment. Sort of goes back to that Linux guy's assumption. You know, who's employing who's got the brains, who's adding the value, and even down to things like one of the aspects of the net, if you like, that's changed was it used to be that your best computing and your fastest networks used to be at work, provided by work and controlled by work. They're not. They're now in your pocket in a very intimate personal device that gives you power wherever you go unless they take the phone off you. And that's a shift. That's quite a big difference.
Okay, let's turn on the lights, and there is
Hi. Hello. It's a question of time, and I've heard you guys speaking before, and you say 18 years for the web, and that's absolutely right. And you say that companies will disappear and behemoths will die. Can you predict a time scale or some sort of roadmap?
Longer than you think.
Well, I think it's going to be mixed, actually. I think the current economic collapse is not just an ordinary cycle. It's something more substantial if you combine it with population growth. So I don't think you can say that the old cycles will happen in the same way. I think this is actually going to happen much faster. I think we're over-focused in entrepreneurial startups at the moment about creating millionaires as internet startups, and we're not focused on creating people who open local shops. And I think governments have got seduced by the concept of creating millionaires. We did work in Cape Town where we were trying to make sure that entrepreneurs stayed in the slum areas. They didn't leave the slum areas, because if you do that, you actually destroy economic regeneration. So I think you've got multiple things happening in parallel here. It's one of the big issues for Europe. I mean, we need Europe to be a counterbalance to the States and to China. And we desperately need Europe to be a counterbalance to those two, because to be quite honest, they're tyrannies in different ways. I mean, America in political terms is like Victorian England. If you're not a millionaire, you can't sit in Parliament. And China is China, right? And the trouble is we haven't got enough cohesion in Europe because we're trying to make it a superstate rather than make it a loosely coupled network of regional identities. Yeah, and I think regional identity and nation state is a comparatively recent phenomenon in Europe. Regional identities have maintained themselves throughout that period, right? So I think what we're going to actually see, if we actually don't get political change happening over the next decade or so, I think this is going to happen in my lifetime, then actually an awful lot of stuff we're talking about the internet is actually going to be subject to a different type of collapse completely. And you're going to get the internet under rigid control as it is in China and elsewhere, and that will be more and more difficult to break because you haven't got the differences. So I think the timescales are linked with political change as well, and I think that's also why companies who can extend, and I think this is the power issue, it's actually using your employees as a sensor network and your customers as a sensor network is going to be absolutely vital, because if you don't react very quickly to small changes, by the time you can catch them with conventional scanning, it will be too late to deal with it. But Europe has got a major role to play in this, both in terms of the number of developers we've got and the cultural context of those developers compared with the cultural context of the States. And I've been arguing this in the Commission now for 10 years. If we continue to try and copy the US model of entrepreneurial startup, we are losing the major advantages of European multiculturalism, and we've got to switch that, and the Commission has got to lead that.
I'd like to second that last remark. There's an excellent piece in the current new issue of the New Yorker by George Packer that I think unpacks the way Silicon Valley works better than anything I've read so far. It is pathological. It's focused on youth. It's focused on creating wealth at all kinds of costs that aren't really reckoned. It encourages subscribing to old forms of political power manipulation that are very much like Victorian England. It's quite nutty and a really bad model in a lot of ways. That's just one answer. Another is a bit more glib, but it's good. It's called Amara's Law, which says we tend to overestimate in the short term and underestimate in the long. And it's almost always easy to mistake something we want in the near future for the horizon, and it tends to be a mistake. But there's another thing that we haven't talked about yet, or maybe not directly. I missed part of David's talk at the beginning, but we have a major global crisis that's going to happen over the next 100 years in global warming. It just is a fact that this is happening, and the seas are going to rise, and where we're sitting now is going to be underwater. And a lot of the coasts in the world we're going to have to deal with this, and we're going to have to deal with this in a big way that's going to require some of the adaptations that David's talking about. How are we going to do agriculture where now we have cities? How are we going to do any of this? And we don't have answers for that yet, and we're going to need them.
Sort of sticking out for the long arc as well, I was really interested when you were saying, Dave, about culture change affecting biology within 2 generations, and you touched on the Enlightenment and the fundamental shift in worldview that happened then. I think even if we get shorter term turmoil in the way industry works, in the way business works, and businesses reshaping and forming themselves, in terms of our behaviours as humans and our expectations as humans, I think we're talking more like 50 or 100 years.
I think you've got something more fundamental, though, because what you've actually got is a dominance of what in political terms is called social atomism, which is an overfocus on the individual, and they assume that organizations are a collection of individuals. Now, social atomism is fine, and the cultural selfishness which goes with it is fine, provided you've got infinitely available resources, which is why it's so successful in the 17th and 18th century. We now don't have infinitely available resources. We need a communitarian alternative, not an atomistic alternative. In really pragmatic terms for companies, and I agree with Doc on this, it's pragmatism. An ecology needs diversity. There isn't one right model. Yet you need an apple and you need a non-apple. Yeah? And I'm one of the people who's had books thrown at me by Steve Jobs, which I'm still quite proud of, all right? With all the swear words, but that's a long story. But fundamentally, we need to start thinking about identities, not about individuals. Because actually, people do coalesce as identities. This is kind of like the modern approach. We and others are pioneer on marketing. You market to identities, you don't market to individuals. And actually, that's how the web works if you look at it. It's a coalescent network.
So sorry, Paolo, but just another question. In this spectrum between fascism and anarchism, how do you achieve structure and help, you know, you talked about communitarianism or some other collective approach of doing things. How do you do that without it turning into ideologies or movements and going all wrong like it always has before?
I'm writing a blog about this today, tomorrow, actually. I think one of the key concepts we haven't got right at the moment is the concept of granularity. So you see it in information. If you have highly fragmented information, it has no coherence. If you have highly structured information, it has no adaptability. So it's almost like there's a sweet point on a curve, and that's where we focus on micronarrative, is the right level of granularity. The same is true in organizations. So you've got kind of like, you know, 5, 15, 150 are good working numbers of organizational sizes. If you get to that level of granularity, you can assemble and reassemble very quickly rather than individuals. And I think the same is true on granularity of political structure. That's why I advocate delegative assembly. You know the people you're voting for. And it's also interesting, in the US and the UK, they actually worked as democracies because every 30 years the parties actually realigned. People crossed the floor, joined different political parties, the whole thing reset. We haven't had a reset in politics since the 1930s. So you've got ossification around two apparent extremes which are actually occupying the same space. So, and I think this is the key issue. We haven't got the granularity right. If we can get the granularity right, a lot of the problems solved.
Other questions from the room? You should come up with something, otherwise we're going to send you back in the dark side of the... Posso avere un microfono qua?
Hi, so my question is about how micronarratives turn into the pretty graphs you've got and where the judgment process comes from in there. And you made the point about patients having a different view to doctors, and I was just wondering how that worked within companies.
Okay, I'll do it quickly. Have you ever filled out an employee satisfaction survey? Okay, well, I'll have to use this as an example. Right? So you get, I mean, we got these all the time in IBM. And it came to me one year and it said, do your managers consult you on a regular basis? 0, not at all, 10 all the time. Yeah, familiar with that form? And I phoned up the head of HR and I got straight through because I just proved that Myers-Briggs is less successful than astrology in predicting human behavior, and she hadn't quite forgiven me for that. It was a 1-year-long experiment and she suppressed the paper. But either way, I got through with what the hell are you doing this time? And I said, how do I answer this question? Because I've got several managers. Sometimes they consult me, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they should, sometimes they shouldn't. And she said, well, average it over the whole year. And I said, you don't understand research. We have a different approach on this. This is a micro-narrative approach. We say, what's a story you would tell your best friend if they were offered a job in your company about what it's like to work for? And we do that with a sampling of the population every week because we want feedback. They then position that story in a triangle between the manager's behavior was altruistic, assertive, analytical. Yeah? Now that comes from cognitive science because actually balancing between 3 points activates the novelty aspect of the brain, so you go deeper. A Likert scale, you can just slap something on quickly. And in a typical project, there will be 6 trials, which gives us 18 metadata items. And I can choose to withhold the story, which is key. Yeah? Now then those numbers allow me to plot the landscapes and do correlations and then to go to the stuff afterwards. So the same is true of customers. And we got one, I can't talk too much about it, but 250 stores across the States. Every time somebody buys a product, every 500th person, I think, to buy a product, if they consume the product in a video booth and speak a story and index the story, they get it for free. That means those landscapes are on the marketing director's desk and they're continuously changing in real time. And they can click on the landscape and listen to the stories, right? Now that is a completely different type of sensor network from the highly linear structured approaches, because it assumes that meaning is constantly shifting, not that meaning is static. So that's how it's done.
Okay. Well, if there are not more questions, I think we can wrap up this panel. So thank you very much.